In Essential Task 4.2, we are going to compare and contrast historic and contemporary theories of intelligence. First looking at the theory that there is one single general intelligence, and then contrasting that to theories of multiple intelligences. The essential task is what you see in front of you. We have one column for one intelligence, two columns for the theories of multiple intelligences, and then an age-related column all the way to the right. I recommend a horizontal concept map for this, and I'll return to the text of the task so you can pause the video before progressing into the concept map. The first theory of intelligence is known as general intelligence, and it was founded by a gentleman by the name of Charles Spearman, who gets a green key psychologist icon. Note the heading of this box. Spearman's theory can sometimes be called general intelligence, but it can also be referred to as the G factor or just a lowercase italicized letter G. So be wary that although I typically call this general intelligence, if somebody just says G in relation to intelligence, they're talking about the same thing. But the underlying idea behind general intelligence is that there is just one general intelligence that is responsible for all of your mental abilities, meaning that an individual who has high G or general intelligence would likely do well at just about anything. Now, what's important here is that doesn't necessarily mean they're an expert in chemistry and an expert in Italian and an expert in calculus. It means if that individual gave those topics their attention and their effort, that they could succeed in those areas. So it's not necessarily that a person is across the board great at everything right now. It just means that an individual with high general intelligence sort of has the prerequisites or that sort of default ability that would allow them to succeed. So, for example, if you consider somebody like Bill Belichick as somebody who might have high general intelligence, basically what you would argue is that, yes, Bill Belichick is good at football in terms of coaching, but if he invested the same amount of time and energy, could he be an equally as good scientist? Well, if you have that impression of Bill Belichick and you buy into the notion of general intelligence, your answer there would be yes, that he has sort of that prerequisite default ability that he translated into football, but had he decided to translate that into cooking or chemistry or physics, he could be equally as successful in other fields. Individuals that score highly on general intelligence tests typically do well in school and have higher GPAs. There's a correlation between those two, a strong positive correlation. Again, correlation is not causation, that's important to note, but there is a very strong correlation between general intelligence scores and overall school performance. General intelligence also typically correlates to higher life earnings. So individuals that score highly on general intelligence tests typically earn more money. Again, correlation is not causation, but there are some interesting positive correlations between general intelligence and other relevant factors, such as school performance. I like to visualize general intelligence like this, where you might in your life do something that's really literary based. You might become a writer. You might become a journalist. You might do something that's very mathematical. Maybe you'll be a chemist or physicist. Maybe someday you'll become an engineer or in some other capacity work as a mechanist. It doesn't really matter where in life you end up going, but your general intelligence is going to overlap in every area of life. And if you have high general intelligence, it just generally means you're more suited to succeed in that area. And again, it doesn't mean you're the world's greatest across the board. It just means if you invested the time, there's the possibility that you would succeed because you already sort of have that benefit of having high G. I like to visualize Spearman as a little bit of a mnemonic here, where he uses his last name, and I think of him literally taking a spear and like hitting a bullseye in this visual where that G is overlapping with all of these various elements of life, verbal, numerical, spatial, and mechanical. And again, the underlying theory behind G, behind general intelligence or the G factor, is that if you have high G, you're well suited to succeed really in any field that you choose to succeed in. It's just a matter of investing the time. Not everybody has time to be a master of everything, but individuals that have high general intelligence sort of have that default ability to potentially succeed. There are contrasting theories, though, and the first contrasting theory is known as Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Gardner gets a green icon as well. Gardner originally believed that there were 8 distinct unique intelligences, and each individual person varied regarding those 8. He somewhat recently, added a 9th. So now there are 9 different forms of intelligence according to Gardner. Ones like kinesthetic, which is movement-based. Ones like verbal, which is your ability to read and write. Mathematical ones. Interpersonal ones, meaning your ability to sort of communicate. Intrapersonal, meaning your sort of understanding of your own emotion. And I'll show you the rest of them in just a moment. But it's the notion that individuals sort of have a variety of different forms of intelligence. And boxing everybody into general intelligence, at least in his opinion, was too limiting. Because, for example, he would look at individuals like Kim Peek that we talked about in 4.1, individuals with what's called savant syndrome, and say, Kim Peek is probably going to do poorly on an assessment of general intelligence, but saying that he is unintelligent by that standard isn't appropriate because he clearly demonstrates skills, abilities that should still be classified as intelligence. It just should be classified in a different manner. These are the 9 forms of intelligence according to Gardner. I would write them down. You don't have to do the circle. You can list them. Most of them are self-explanatory. I'll go through them quickly, but most of them by name are self-explanatory. Intrapersonal is an understanding of sort of your own emotions. That's what intrapersonal means. Interpersonal means communication ability. Visual means what it sounds like, so things like art. Naturalistic might be one you'd connect to being a farmer. Logical and mathematic, as the name indicates. Existential is actually the most recent one. That's having sort of a spiritual intelligence. Musical is what it sounds like. Bodily or kinesthetic is what it sounds like. And then finally, verbal. Linguistic is, again, what it sounds like. But if you were asked a question, what might an architect strive in or really be quite profound in? That would be something like visual, spatial, maybe a little bit logical, mathematical, not necessarily musical. So this allows really anybody across the board to be intelligent, just sort of intelligent in their own way. As a mnemonic to differentiate Gardner from Spearman, I think of the notion that Spearman had that spear that he was holding with that one point at the end. When you garden, you need a lot of different tools. And I use that as a way of differentiating that Spearman's the guy for one intelligence, Gardner's the guy for lots of intelligences. If you think Gardner is a little bit too broad, including things like naturalistic and spiritual as forms of intelligence, you might buy into Robert Sternberg. Sternberg should have a small letter C. So he's not a key psychologist. He gets a small letter C for contributor. But Sternberg proposed what's called the triartic theory of intelligence. And instead of having 9 intelligences that were very specialized, he was a little bit more broad in how he classified intelligence, but he made 3 different categories: creative, analytical, and practical. Creative intelligence is simply demonstrating imaginative and innovative skills, and that can be reflected in a lot of different behaviors. You could have a very innovative game plan for basketball or field hockey and end up winning a championship game because of that really unique game plan and strategy that was implemented. Well, that's creative. You could write a great book series. That's creative. You could be artistic and produce this really wonderful work of art. That's creative. You could have a great new business plan or come up with this new idea as an entrepreneur. That's also creative. So it can be reflected not just in art, but it can be reflected in things that have kinesthetic elements to it, movement-based with sports, obviously visual with art, obviously verbal with written. Analytic intelligence is the type of stuff that you would use in school. So your ability to perform on an IQ test, your ability to maintain a high GPA, overall good school performance, any of those basic academic problem-solving skills would fall under the analytic category. And that doesn't matter for the category in terms of class. This could be math, science, psychology, history, English. It doesn't matter in what field we're talking about, but that basic academic problem-solving skill is reflected with analytic intelligence. And then finally, and this might be the one that Gardner lacks in his 9, simply just street smarts, that basic sort of common sense, interpersonal. Interpersonal was a Gardner 9, but it didn't necessarily have things like street smarts involved. Practical intelligence is the stuff that people clearly exhibit. It's just not necessarily reflected on tests, and it's not even necessarily reflected creatively. Your ability to negotiate down the price of a car that you're trying to buy. Well, that doesn't necessarily fit any of the other categories. That's practical intelligence. That's that street smarts. That's that instinct that you need when running a business that's not out of a textbook, that's not necessarily just making a new product. It's that people smarts, common sense, street smart element. Your ability to network, for example, in college, that's practical intelligence. That doesn't fit the textbooks. That's not necessarily creative, depending on how it works. Just that ability to build relationships. That's what practical intelligence would involve. Not the greatest mnemonic, but Sternberg's last name has 3 E's in it. He's the guy that's about 3 intelligences. That might help you differentiate Sternberg from Gardner, the 2 individuals in this essential task that argue that there are different forms of intelligence. The final column all the way to the right is under the category of age. So the 2 types of intelligence that we're about to talk about, you can agree with both of these. So you can agree with the findings of Raymond Cattell, the individual that we'll talk about in the column all the way to the right, but then also still buy into one of these 3 theories. Typically, if you buy into general intelligence, you disagree with Gardner and Sternberg. If you agree with Gardner, you typically then disagree with Spearman. You don't really believe in all 3 of these simultaneously. Typically, you would buy into one and refute the other 2. You can buy into one of these and still believe this age-related column all the way to the right, though. This is outside of that debate. But Raymond Cattell proposed that, taking into consideration everything that we just talked about and where you fall on the spectrum of multiple versus single intelligence, that there are 2 different types of mental abilities: crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. These are very common bullets on the AP exam, and almost assuredly will appeal it as multiple choice questions if they're not on the FRQ. Crystallized intelligence, I define, this is not the textbook definition, but I sort of define it as your lifetime factual intellectual achievement. It's basically all of the facts, the vocab that you've learned over the course of your whole life. Thinking back to Unit 1, this would be your semantic memories, your factual memories, the things that you would need to succeed on Jeopardy, the things that you would need to succeed at trivia, the things that you typically need on most fact-based oriented assessments that you take. Basically the types of assessments that you're going to see in this class. And the way this works is every day, in one way, shape, or form, you gain more factual information. Your crystallized intelligence increases every single day that you are on Earth. Because even if it's a trivial fact, like what happened on November 10th, 2020, well, it might be trivial, it might be small potatoes relative to other facts in your life, but it's still technically a general fact that you learn, which means every day that you live, your crystallized intelligence goes up. On the other hand, your fluid intelligence is a little bit different. Your fluid intelligence is reflected by your ability to logically and quickly solve new problems, sort of regardless of the factual information that you've learned prior. So, for example, if you're troubleshooting an issue with your car or your computer, or perhaps you're playing a game of chess and you're encountering this new situation that you've never been in, your ability to quickly process all of these new stimuli that you're encountering and come up with a logical, rational decision is reflected by your fluid intelligence. At your age, and then certainly as you progress into your 20s, your fluid intelligence is actually going to be at its peak. Meaning if you picked up a new computer app or a new phone app, or you encountered some type of new behavior and skill, your fluid intelligence luckily is going to be at its high point, and you're probably going to succeed. Your fluid intelligence starts off really low. I mean, as you're an infant, you're not really going to reflect fluid intelligence. It peaks around 25 or 30, and then it starts to wane as you get older. Fluid intelligence might explain why older people have a really difficult time picking up new technology. Because under that condition, they're trying to logically and quickly solve a new problem in a new situation, but they simply have a difficult time grasping the breadth of how new that technology might be and all of the small elements of it. So fluid intelligence is a little bit different. You start with basically none because you're an infant. It starts to increase in your teens, into your 20s. It peaks around 30, and then from that point on, it starts to wane. And certainly when you look at somebody who's 75 or 80, they might have a ton of crystallized intelligence. If you've ever sat down with somebody older and asked them what life was like, they can tell you a ton about all the wars they lived through, presidents they lived through, events they've lived through. But that fluid intelligence, that's going to have waned. As a mnemonic, when I look at these 2 side by side, I think about if you were to actually go on an episode of Jeopardy, you might win a lot of money, maybe get a lot of jewelry because of it, get a lot of crystals. I think about the notion of you gain more crystals if you win jewelry or if you win Jeopardy. And I try and connect trivia and Jeopardy with crystallized intelligence because it's the type of intelligence you would need on Jeopardy. Fluid intelligence, I think about it like a cup of water. It starts off empty. You're born. You fill it up to the peak. That's 25 or 30. And then as you sit there and drink the water, it obviously goes down. That's how fluid intelligence works. It starts basically at nothing, goes up to 25 to 30, and then wanes. I like to show you this example. This is the average age of chess grandmasters, meaning at what point in their life did they reach the status of grandmaster, which is the highest level in chess. And you notice that they peak typically in their late 20s into early 30s, a little bit past 30. is the highest chess rating that people typically have. And as they get older, that starts to wane. One of the reasons might be that this is about the time where your fluid intelligence starts to peak. Very often you see chess champions that are quite young. The picture here is of Magnus Carlsen, a recent chess world champion, many years running, one of the best, if not still the best chess player in the world, in his 20s, illustrating that perhaps he's really utilizing the fact that his fluid intelligence is, at this point, still peaking. Just to visualize this, and this is where the concept map ends, your crystallized intelligence starts off at nothing. Obviously, you don't have any facts when you're born, but it just progressively increases until your old age. It never starts to wane. It never goes down. Fluid intelligence, on the other hand, starts at the same point, peaks, though, in your young adulthood, and then starts to wane once you sort of hit late adulthood, middle age, and then certainly old age.